Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final event in Tax Justice Series 2023, early setting of a new tax justice era. My name is Moana Ali. I'm Deputy Director of Policy at the Tax Justice Network. And today's event is the country-by-country path to global justice. So country-by-country reporting has been one of the main financial transparency tools to tackle tax abuse by multinational. It's actually the C of the Tax Justice Network, ABC of fiscal transparency. It should be public to allow also civil society organization, academia, and journalists to analyze the data, identify cases of abuse, and hold authorities to account. During this event, speakers, I will introduce them in a second, were closely involved in the legislative process. They will explain the dynamics and politics of public country-by-country reporting in Europe, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Australia, and beyond. And with the ongoing historic negotiations on international tax cooperation at the United Nations, insights from African experts will be shared as well regarding the potential incorporation of country-by-country reporting into the UN process. So I'm pleased to introduce our wonderful panelists today. Evelyn Mwendo, a policy advisor at the Tax Justice Network Africa. Jason Ward, Principal Analyst at the Center of International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research and the Tax Justice Network Australia. Olivia Lally, the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Eurodad. Zor Kamilin, Policy Director at FACT Coalition. And Paul Monahan, Chief Executive at the Fair Tax Foundations. I will just mention that the speakers will speak in English throughout the whole event, but please know that we have interpretation available to Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And if you want to listen to your preferred language, just click the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and select the language you want to follow. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the top of your screen. If you want to ask any question to the panelists, we will turn to the Q&A in the latter half of the session. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Evelyn Mwendo. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. I hope everything is okay with my sound. That's good to know. So as has been mentioned, my name is Evelyn Mwendo. I am the Policy Associate, Tax and Investment in Tax Justice Network Africa. And I'd briefly like to talk about what the status of country-by-country reporting is in African countries, and also to give some context as to why public country-by-country reporting is particularly important for African countries, and why we are also trying to move all these tax standards away from the OECD and to the UN. So let me just start with some basic facts or basic data on the status of country-by-country reporting in Africa right now. So in Africa, we have around 10 African countries that currently have any domestic legislation on country-by-country reporting. And most of these countries are inclusive framework members. And amongst these 10 African countries, we have even fewer that have any sort of exchange of information framework. And even if they do have an exchange of information framework, for many of them, they're unable to access these reports for one main reason, and that's because many African countries do not meet the data and confidentiality standards that have been put in place under both the Global Forum as well as the OECD inclusive framework. So we have a situation where perhaps the greatest, I don't want to use the word victims, but perhaps the greatest victims of profit shifting do not have access to that data. And this is something that was brought out by the FACTI panel, that while realizing that country by country reporting is very important to address illicit financial flows in developing countries, to address profit shifting, amongst other things, the current framework as it is under both the OECD inclusive framework and the Global Forum, really, rather than promotes, actually detracts, especially for developing countries. And this is because of the very strict confidentiality and data standards that will require African countries to pour resources into limited resources in terms of
Sorry, we've lost our speaker. Moran, maybe can I hand back to you?
Yeah, okay, so maybe we can come back to Evelyn later. I hope so. Her connection will be better. So maybe we'll come up to Jason Ward. Can I hand over to you? And maybe after you, we'll come back to Evelyn, please. Thank you.
Sure. Can everyone hear me? Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning. I come to you from the future. It's Tuesday here, and I also come to you from the unceded land of the Darug people, and I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So just as a quick background, I've been very active in the Tax Justice Network in Australia for about 10 years now, and CICTAR, the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research, is now 5 years old, and with very much help from TJN globally. We do detailed forensic analysis of corporate tax dodging and look at accountability on public spending. We work very closely with trade unions and help them use exposing tax dodging to advance their organizing, bargaining, and policy changes. And we bring unions into the broader fight for tax justice. We're doing a lot of work across the global north, and we're now expanding to work with our union partners in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So just sorry that we lost Evelyn, and hopefully we'll get back to her, but I'll continue on the public country by country reporting. We know that it's been a huge help to tax authorities in OECD countries, and we know that having that data public would be a huge help to tax authorities across the global south who currently don't have access to that same level of information. And obviously, governments in the global south are far more reliant on corporate tax income and have less resources to tackle the rampant problem of profit shifting by multinational corporations. The Australian taxation office is better than most. And we know that having that data public will also allow the civil society to hold tax authorities accountable to make sure that they are pursuing collections from multinationals to collecting the obligations that companies owe to society and to pay for the resources that they themselves use as well. Crucially, I think requiring public country by country reporting anywhere will drive opinion and drive demands for further change once the multinational tax dodging schemes are exposed and can be seen through the data. And having public country-by-country reporting is essential to inform future tax reforms and to make progress towards closing additional loopholes. It is not a revenue measure in itself, but it will drive solutions that will increase revenue, and it will drive public opinion to make those changes. It will also begin to shift corporate behavior when the dirty deeds of companies and how they're using profit shifting is out there in the public. They may be inclined to change their behavior. And crucially, once one jurisdiction requires full public country-by-country, it will decrease the corporate and government resistance everywhere and enable the beginning of a new global standard. So in the Australian context, we've been campaigning for public country-by-country reporting and other tax reforms for many, many years. And in doing so, we have shifted public opinion and mobilized new support from unions and others for tax reform. And we did this by sort of very much focusing on core issues for the public and for union members in particular, looking at domestic funding for public services. We now have 9 years of tax transparency data in Australia for all large companies. And that has been crucial to get to the point where we're at now in terms of tax reform and public opinion on multinational tax dodging, and on the verge of hopefully strong public country-by-country reporting. We won significant changes even under our previous conservative government. Since about 2019, CBCR, working with allies around the world, has focused specifically on mobilizing investor support for the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative Tax Standard, which is the first standard specifically developed for public country-by-country reporting, and went into effect in 2021 and is now getting picked up voluntarily by a number of countries, and it's what the Australian legislation has been based on. We've also done a lot of work filing shareholder resolutions to require companies to implement public country-by-country reporting. And that investor support has actually given our government a bit of a stronger spine to proceed forward. It sort of splits the notion of business is against this and shows that some of the world's largest asset managers actually are keen to and demanding transparency as well. And it's also helped to shift the regulatory dialogue in a number of places. So I'll give a quick plug. Microsoft, who's just been hit with a nearly $30 billion tax bill from the IRS, has a shareholder vote this week. Last year, we got 23% of the vote, and we're hoping that given the tax bill in front of shareholders, that they'll be inclined to support tax transparency even more. So implementing public country-by-country reporting was an election promise from our new Labour government. It was included in the government's budget, and we had amazing draft legislation this year, and we expected implementation in July that has passed. However, in the final weeks before legislation was set to be introduced, there was intense lobbying from global multinationals, from the Big Four accounting firms, and in particular from the OECD. So in the past, the OECD has been there as setting a floor for transparency. And in this case, they've imposed a ceiling. The OECD is now headed by Matthias Cormann, who's Australia's second worst export after Rupert Murdoch. Matthias Cormann is an arch conservative and bending the OECD in a direction worse than it had been before. So the OECD threatened that if Australia went forward, that other OECD member states would cut off the existing exchange of information that they use under the OECD's confidential country-by-country reporting. And that was a serious threat to the Australian government. But the intensity of last-minute lobbying clearly shows how significant this simple transparency measure will be, and how it's definitely viewed by multinationals as a major threat to the status quo. So where we're at now is that the government remains committed to public country-by-country reporting, and we expect legislation to be introduced very soon, possibly this week. And we expect that to be voted on probably early next year for July implementation. The government has the votes to pass this legislation, so we're confident that it'll come forward. The danger, however, is that new legislation would follow a European Union model, and that model was, which I think we'll hear about later, was written by corporate lobbyists, and it only requires disclosure from a limited number of jurisdictions and not full public country-by-country reporting. So Australia's list of jurisdictions is a far better list, includes about 40 countries, but it's still problematic to select a list and not do full public country-by-country reporting. So in a format like could happen here and like has happened in the European Union, much of the world, including the US, the UK, and their networks of tax havens, China, India, Brazil, are all included as one lump sum. And it's really difficult to see what's going on in the data and how and where profits might be shifted. So we'll continue to demand full public country-by-country reporting, including all jurisdictions. And we want it to, again, continue to follow the GRI tax standard. We're going to keep mobilizing domestic and international unions to support the issue, working with our civil society partners. And we are really focused on pushing major Australian and international investors to support the full legislation. So we do have investors with $10 trillion in assets that have publicly supported full public country-by-country reporting, and we'll continue to mobilize their support to win. So just to wrap up in conclusion, stay tuned, and we ask you to support if we need it, to support, to push the government to really follow through on its commitments and to do full public country-by-country and not to bend to the will of OECD and OECD member states to push back against that. If we win in Australia, it'll be a global game changer and go a long way to setting a new global transparency standard. And we absolutely need to shine a bright light on the scale of multinational profit shifting, which continues to grow, and its impact on governments globally to fund essential public services and a transition to a fairer and more sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason, and we'll definitely stay tuned for the vote in this week. It's going to be very interesting, and we cross fingers it will succeed. So I would like now to come back to Evelyn. Can you hear us well? You're muted. Please unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can't see you.
Okay, so just 1 second. Apologies for this. I've had to use my phone because my laptop has completely refused. So apologies for the interruption earlier on. Allow me to proceed from where I had stopped with regard to the basic data on country-by-country reporting and the main challenges that African countries are facing, especially in adhering to the OECD standards of country-by-country reporting. So as I had mentioned, only 10 African countries have country-by-country reporting domestic legislation, fewer have exchange of information frameworks, and even if they do, many are not benefiting from it because they do not meet or are not in compliance with the confidentiality standards of the OECD. So this is a very big barrier for African countries towards benefiting from country-by-country reporting, and this is particularly why public country-by-country reporting is especially important for us, especially where these multinational enterprises are domiciled. And some of the weaknesses of country-by-country reporting as it's set up by the OECD were actually pointed out by the FACTI panel back in 2021. They say that the revenue threshold is too high, 750 million euros. They also did say that it would require quite a lot of resources, especially for developing countries and African countries particularly, to pour into especially setting up these frameworks as well as the infrastructure that would be necessary in order to benefit from country-by-country reporting as per the OECD standards. And these are much needed resources because a lot of the tax administrations in Africa do not have the capacity in terms of the numbers, the human resources, as well as the financial resources to adhere to, for instance, the exchange of information standards as per the OECD. So for this reason, there's been a lot of, I would say, unrest or lack of satisfaction with not only country-by-country reporting, but generally some of the inclusive framework processes, and particularly the two-pillar solution, which African countries have been participating in. And this is why there's been such a strong call from the continent in moving the setting of global tax standards away from the OECD and into a more participative and universal platform, such as the United Nations particularly. And this is something that we hope that CBCR can be one of the issues that can be addressed within the United Nations forum. And as you may know, there's been quite a lot of pushback on this, particularly from the OECD member countries who have pushed back on this and have pretty much accused the ones who are spearheading this process of trying to reinvent the wheel. However, there is evidence, because since 2015, since the beginning of the BEPS project, and also since 2016, since several African countries became members of the inclusive framework, that there is so much need for us to move away from the OECD and move to a forum where we have equal footing in terms of agenda setting, and we have equal footing in terms of setting up technical standards that actually work for African countries. Because as evidence from those number of years, there's been little progress in addressing profit shifting, at least for developing and African countries, as because of the difficulties in meeting the standards that have been set by the OECD and in moving resources in order to meet the standards, when some of these issues could be solved, for instance, by simply having public country-by-country reporting, amongst other things. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. I'm glad it worked out. I know you need to leave early, and you will not be able to stay for the Q&A. So would it be fine that I just ask you one question now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So we know that low and middle income countries have been historically excluded from the country-by-country data. Mentioned that as well. And in a recent white paper that the UK Foreign Policy has published, they acknowledge that, and they said that they recognize that, well, low and middle income countries don't have access, many other countries would benefit. And it's a great step forward, this acknowledgement, but at the same time, we know that in the context of the UN Tax Convention, the UK was actually one of the biggest blockers and tried to water down the resolution. So my question is basically, what strategies can be implemented to not only expand access to country-by-country reporting data for low income countries, but also to overcome the obstacles within the UN negotiation process and to ensure that it will be more exclusive this time? Yeah, thank you.
So we've been in a mood of celebration in the past few weeks because of the adoption of the recent resolution. However, we do understand that this celebration is very temporary because there are quite a few hurdles which are standing in our way of finally having a proper UN tax convention. And some of the strategies that I know are being discussed is, firstly, those terms of reference. It's something that we really need to deliberate on as a continent and also as the global South generally. So that's something that we're putting a lot of focus on. The other thing is, of course, the political will. I think within the African continent at this point, we've seen quite an exercise of goodwill, especially politically speaking. However, we realize we need to come to the table, not only as the continent, but also really generally as the global South. So enhancing the support that we're getting on this, not only from African countries, but also from other developing countries and other global South countries is something that we're looking into. And we're realizing that there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of South-to-South cooperation. We may have it within the continent, but then in terms of the global South, there's a lot of room for that. So that's something that we're also in discussion on. And we're discussing having a convening, bringing together many of these key individuals who have been there in the fight for a UN tax convention for quite a number of years, and pretty much coming up with a strategy for our next steps forward in terms of addressing, firstly, the countries that we know are going to be pushing back on this process, and also the next steps in terms of the processes that we have to do within the UN processes and within the UN framework, and also just generally discussing how not to repeat the same mistakes that we've seen in other attempts of multilateralism, so to speak, such as the OECD inclusive framework and what we're seeing. And then another big concern is how to address the already ongoing processes that are happening. We have half the continent being members of the inclusive framework, and we know at the very least, Pillar 1 will not be happening within the expected timelines that it was supposed to happen. However, many African countries are facing a lot of pressure from the OECD in terms of still implementing Pillar 2 and implementing other aspects of the BEPS project. It's still ongoing. There's quite a lot of pressure that is on African countries in that regard. So we also need to strategize on how to address such concerns. But one thing is for sure that, yes, it's very easy to come for the OECD to come to Kenya, or for the USA to come to Kenya and pretty much pressure us to get rid of our digital services taxes as an individual country. However, when we work together and when we work as a region, such as what we saw within the African group and what we're seeing within the African Union, we have a much stronger bargaining position than we do as individual countries. And that's something we hope to also take forward to other developing countries and generally the global South. That I know, as cliche as it sounds, it really does pay off to have solidarity in this. And this is really the time to ensure that we come together for that purpose. That's all.
Thank you so much for this insights from the African continent in this context. Interesting. So I would like to hand over to the next speaker, Olivia, to share with us your experience from Europe in this context. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Moran, and good evening, everyone. Is it okay to share a couple of slides? This was my attempt to managed to share lots of information in a short time. And I'm hoping that they're appearing.
Yeah, we can see.
Great. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. TJN very kindly invited me to share a little bit about public country by country reporting in the European Union. And I think Jason has already shared a bit of a preview. And I can just say that Eurodad is a development finance network, and we have the pleasure to host Tax Justice Europe, the regional network of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. So we've been fighting for public country by country reporting for many years. And I personally work at EU level. So I've been deeply involved in the negotiations on our very, very poor legislation here. But have the pleasure of working with a lot of civil society organizations and pushing for something better. So I'll share a little bit of an insight into I suppose the state of play and what the country by country reporting rules look like in the EU at the moment, and maybe say something very briefly on the politics. It might come as a bit of a surprise to hear that actually within the EU, we've had public country by country reporting for the banking sector for a decade now. After the financial crisis, the EU introduced public country by country reporting for the financial sector through something called the Capital Requirements Directive. And this was really at a time, you'll remember, when there was widespread public anger and broad mistrust in the banking sector. And at that time, public country by country reporting was seen as one part of making sure we could rebuild public trust. So we've had this one sector publishing country by country reports for a number of years in the EU. And it's been really useful for a number of reasons. I think it has shown the value of public country by country reporting in the ways that Jason and Evelyn have already outlined. It's also been really helpful in allaying business concerns about the transparency, and it's been operating alongside the secret country by country reporting. So I wanted to kind of point to a couple of things we've learned from having this standard and having a legal framework here for a number of years. But of course, there are some learnings. So maybe briefly, just to say that on the back of having publicly available country by country reporting, we've had really extensive research into the banking sector's use of tax havens. And of course, here in the EU, we're home to a number of the most significant and harmful tax havens there are. But the public country by country reporting has really looked at the relationship of the EU to other countries. And throughout that research, it has shown that this kind of analysis would not be able to take place without public country by country reporting data. So the alternative versions simply can't allow that. And at the same time, analysis has shown a lot of reassuring information when it comes to the impact on the banking sector's competitiveness and any concerns about the impact of transparency on profitability or on business competitiveness. And there is some analysis to show that the profitability of the banking sector didn't change after public disclosure. And actually the banks themselves also spoke in the European Parliament where they shared that they didn't have any concerns having practiced public country by country reporting about risks to business competitiveness. And I think that's a really important point when we hear a lot about corporate lobbying in other regions, and we've seen unfortunate high-end and influential corporate lobbying here in the EU when we come to the legislation for all sectors, but it's very reassuring to see that. And I think something worth saying is that you'll notice that this predates the secret country by country reporting that was introduced by the OECD as part of the BEPS package. And BEPS Action 13 is the action that brought in the non-public country by country reporting. And sometimes we hear arguments that public country by country reporting isn't compatible with that. But we've had the banking sector in the EU publishing public country by country reports alongside the OECD secret reporting for a number of years without any problems. So that should be a great assurance to campaigners and to policymakers in other regions. And this data has been used by such a variety of stakeholders, which really, again, points to the importance of having this publicly available, and not only to the legislator here in Europe, but also outside of the EU, academics, journalists, civil society organizations, trade unions, and the members of the general public have all used the data, which is why having this publicly accessible and in a way that can be used is so important. And one final thing I wanted to mention is that this measure has, I think, it's interesting to see the measure has applied to all banks regardless of their turnover. So where we see a lot of concerns about transparency and the administration and the costs of that, we've seen this measure work very well, regardless of the size of the institutions it's applying to for a number of years. So these are all really reassuring. And the public CBCR for the banks has been really popular. It isn't perfect. The content of the country-by-country reports themselves absolutely needs improvement, and it's not so accessible. It's usually published by the multinational themselves and an annual report or on their website somewhere. So it's not all that useful in its own format when we want to assess broader tax avoidance trends, or we want to look at how the tax system as a whole is functioning. But I think there's a lot of really positive learnings from that. So then going from the single sector to the EU's long pathway towards public country-by-country reporting for all large multinationals. It's been a topic of conversation in the EU for more than 40 years, and actually Tax Justice Network wrote a really interesting paper on that. But it took some time to have a proposal for legislation here in the EU. And back in 2016, after the Panama Papers, we finally got a legislative proposal for public country-by-country reporting, but it took until the end of 2021 for an agreement on what that would look like. And back then, the European Union adopted new transparency rules that will oblige some large multinational corporations from all sectors to report some additional information in some jurisdictions. And there's a reason I'm putting a big emphasis on the word some. While this is commonly called the Public Country-by-Country Reporting Directive, or EU Public CBCR rules, it's actually quite misleading to call it public country-by-country reporting, because the outcome is so weak that companies won't actually be obliged to report on their activities on a country-by-country basis in each country they operate in. So I wanted to share a little bit more information about what the EU rules are and why they deliver country-by-country reporting in name, but not public country-by-country reporting in reality. So the key problems are the geographic scope. So the multinational corporations only have to report on their activities in the EU and on a small number of jurisdictions that are on a list commonly called the EU Tax Havens Blacklist and Grey List. This is the full name you'll see on the slides. And it's really, really disappointing to see this really narrow scope, because that means if the rules were enforced today, multinational corporations wouldn't have to publish information on more than 75% of countries worldwide. And that means that publicly available information isn't complete, doesn't give an accurate overview of multinationals' tax practices, which Jason has already explained is really necessary to do that analysis. And it also means that countries who don't have access through the secret system, and that's particularly countries in the global south, don't find information on their jurisdictions in the reporting. So that's really, really problematic. The threshold is also a key area of concern. So companies have to have a 750 million euro turnover for 2 consecutive years to trigger the reporting obligation. And that means that the vast majority of large multinationals are outside the scope of reporting. They just don't have to publish the CBCR. And that's also the majority of multinationals operating in the EU, not just those operating in the global south. So not only is that excessively high and really minimizes the companies that are covered, it actually diverges from the existing standard we have for the banking sector, and it's even higher than the threshold included in the OECD secret country-by-country reporting. The EU directive also comes with a loophole that we like to call the corporate get-out clause. It has a more technical name in the directive, but it really is accurate to call it a get-out clause because it allows companies to delay reporting for up to 4 years if they decide that information that should be in the country-by-country report is commercially sensitive. But there's no definition of commercially sensitive, there's no need to have approval, and there's no monitoring mechanism. So this is really an open loophole that allows companies to avoid reporting for a very significant period of time. And there is no central database, so the challenge we have with the existing public CBCR for the banks continues. The one positive is that the data is going to be accessible in a machine readable format. It will be free and there'll be a common template. It doesn't have everything we like. We really pushed for the EU to reflect the same country-by-country reporting template that we have in the GRI 207 tax standard, which is a more comprehensive form. And they haven't done that. So we hope, at least when it comes to the template, that they'll give some guidance on how those who want to go beyond the EU standard can. So that's what the rules say. But how are they coming into force? Well, an EU directive is something that is decided at EU level, and it is a minimum standard. And each EU country has a period of time to introduce that into its national legislation, and then another period of time for those rules to come into effect. So you can see the timeline on your screen. And our member states had until June of this year to introduce these rules in their national law. 10 EU member states met the deadline, and 17 countries missed the deadline. So we're quite behind. That's actually quite common in the EU, and especially we see a lot of member states drag their heels when it comes to transparency measures around corporate tax. And I guess you may be wondering, since this is a minimum standard, if we've actually seen any good examples coming from those countries that have introduced the rules. So each country is completely free to update the rules and augment them. So they could introduce full public country-by-country reporting in their national law. And among those 10 are some of the countries that have pushed for public country-by-country reporting in the past. But not a single member state has opted to introduce real public country-by-country reporting so far, which is quite disappointing. There are lots of reasons for this. Civil society, of course, is advocating for change. There are other stakeholders who may perhaps be lobbying against that. But I specifically wanted to point to a big scandal that we had earlier this year, when Politico exposed a series of letters sent by the European Commission, our legislator, to EU member states to advise them not to improve on the EU directive during transposition, which they call gold plating. And the European Commission claimed that this was technical advice, but the members of the European Parliament, who are the directly elected representatives at EU level, and civil society organisations, including Eurodad, raised very serious concerns around this inappropriate political interference. In fact, it was such a big scandal that the MEPs who were responsible for negotiating the directive not only wrote to the Commission, but also raised oral questions and even held a public hearing with the European Commissioner responsible. So it's a really disappointing and worrying trend to see this. And we do still have quite a number of member states who have the opportunity to improve this. So we continue to advocate and hope for a better outcome. But at the same time, I think we should be quite cognizant of the efforts to limit effective public country-by-country reporting in the EU. I'm conscious of time. I won't keep speaking, but I did really want to show the difference between real public country-by-country reporting and what has been agreed with this EU directive. We all agree that public country-by-country reporting should require that multinationals report on a country-by-country basis. It's in the name. If the EU rules were in force today, this is the difference. The geographic scope is so limited that 75% of countries worldwide would not be covered, which means there's no useful information for any of the countries that disappear on the map. We don't have a complete picture of multinationals' tax practices, and we really can't use this data to assess the tax avoidance that is happening. So it really fundamentally undermines any value in this initiative. And just to show you, this is the difference between country by country reporting and the EU directive. So I would say there are positives in looking at the public CBCR we have for the banking sector, and I hope that this can be the basis for strong rules in other regions. But we have to urge extreme caution in following the EU's example, because if we look at this broader EU directive, it really is public country by country reporting in name, but not in reality. There are some opportunities for change that I wanted to flag. Of course, a number of countries still need to introduce laws, and they can go further, and civil society organizations are pushing them to do so. But we need further legislation at EU level. And we are having elections for the members of the European Parliament next June. So we'll have a new European Parliament and a new European Commission term starting in 2024, where we hope to find more support for effective transparency. And as Evelyn also mentioned, thanks to the leadership of the Africa Group, work on a framework convention in the UN is going to begin. And although the European Union is typically very close to the OECD, we hope this can be the basis for global cooperation towards real transparency. So I'll stop there for now, but happy to take any questions and of course speak further.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Very, very interesting, and we'll definitely come back to questions after that to learn more about this. So I would like to hand over now to Zorka Melin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moran and Tax Justice Network, for inviting me. Let me begin by saying a few words about who we are, the Facts Coalition. I know that many of you are probably already familiar, but for those of you who are not familiar with our work, Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, we are a US-based nonpartisan alliance that brings together more than 100 groups, all of whom work towards a fair tax system, and we promote policies that combat the harmful impacts of corrupt financial policies. So our members, it's a very broad umbrella. Our members include labor unions, international development and human rights NGOs, domestic economic justice groups, anti-corruption watchdogs, environmental NGOs, and others. And we're also a proud member of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. For us, really, this issue of public country by country reporting is one of our priorities, because we believe that this information should be available to developing countries too, and not just OECD governments, as other panelists explained, Evelyn and others. And so we work quite closely with our global partners in Tax Justice Network Africa, CBCR, and many others here. So I'm really happy to join this panel, especially because for once, we have some good progress and momentum that we can report from the US front, which doesn't happen very often. And although, I've only joined the FACT team a few months ago, so, I can't claim all the credit. This has, of course, been a long campaign going back many, many years, but just this August, we had a significant victory when the US Accounting Standards Setter, Financial Accounting Standards Board, or FASB, voted unanimously to improve income tax disclosures. This took them, I think it was almost a decade. And to be sure, the final result is a bit convoluted, and it falls short of full country by country reporting. So I want to say that at the outset, but it's still a very helpful step forward. So it's quite technical, but in short, I will explain for our purposes, the most important part of this FASB accounting update is that public American companies, so those that follow US gap in their financial statement reporting will have to break down by each jurisdiction, each foreign tax effect that has a substantial impact on their overall taxes paid. So what this means, for example, if we have a US multinational that does business in the US and maybe some other countries in Europe or Africa, but they book most of their profits in a tax haven jurisdiction, like for example Ireland or Bermuda, which often we've seen that happen in many cases, then that company wouldn't, in all likelihood, let me say, they would likely have to publish the total financial impact of these tax arrangements that they have in Ireland, just for example, and so the total aggregate effect, and also to break that down by each major tax effect. So what that means is, whether it's a tax rate differential or tax credits, incentives, etc. And so, in all likelihood, I just say because there are certain de minimis thresholds that have to be met. In addition, so that's just for public companies. There's also another piece of this update that covers not only public, but also private companies and requires them to report their income taxes paid for each country that makes up at least 5% of their total tax burden. So again, there is a threshold. And all of this information we expect to see reporting begin in 2025. The board has already voted, it's just pending final confirmation, which should happen this month, so really any day now. I said it's not full country by country reporting because notice what's missing here is the non-tax operational information, number of employees and sales, and et cetera, which is absolutely necessary to put the tax numbers in context. So we will not have that, but still it's something that we see a big win, as a big win here, and one that I would attribute to a long persistent campaign over many years, as I've said, and especially the critical factor was very extensive involvement of investors. The FASB board members noted that they met with more than 50 investors, and all of these meetings were overwhelmingly supportive. So that was a decisive factor. We know actually that more generally, investors really care about this. We know that investors representing more than $10 trillion in assets under management are on the record as supporting public country by country reporting. And that's, I'm quoting a figure that was calculated by Oxfam America, which is a fact coalition member. Why do investors care about this? Well, the risks of aggressive international tax practices are very relevant for them. In the US, we have seen a number of huge, absolutely huge transfer pricing cases that can run into the many billions of dollars. So Jason mentioned the Microsoft case, which involves nearly $30 billion in back taxes. So that's not even including interest and penalties, which, the figure could balloon even further. There's also another longstanding transfer pricing case that the IRS has brought, involves Coca-Cola. So, they're being hit with a $14 billion tax bill. And it's not just the US, in Europe, there's been some of the huge tax fines that we've seen against companies like Apple. So these are very big numbers that are clearly very material to the company's bottom line and therefore to their investors. And, speaking of Microsoft, as Jason mentioned, there is the AGM later this week, and we'll see a shareholder resolution that calls for public country by country reporting. That's being considered again after it was introduced at last year's AGM, where it garnered very considerable support. It was actually the highest performing resolution that was on the table. So, and it's not just Microsoft. We've also seen shareholder resolutions brought at a number of other major US companies, Cisco, Amazon, as well as major oil companies, where Oxfam America filed resolutions that includes Exxon, Chevron, and Conoco. So investors, and not just investors, but also investor analysts, they find this information useful because it helps them better understand the tax planning risks not just tax risk, also other regulatory risks and even geopolitical risks of where these companies are operating, the companies that they hold. So these are all of the reasons that we feel this is a job. While we welcome the step that was taken by the accounting board, we feel like there's a job that really should be finished by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the main financial regulator here in the US. And we're not the only ones who think that. There's a number of members of Congress who agree with us and have introduced a bill that's called Disclosure of Tax Havens and Offshoring Act. It was introduced in the Senate Banking Committee and has the support of 12 senators. We are glad to have that bill. It's very helpful, although I should note, in our view, it's not necessary because the SEC actually already has the authority to write this regulation, just as part of their core mission to protect investors by informing them about material risks. And clearly these tax risks that can run into tens of billions of dollars are very material, even for companies as big as Microsoft and Coca-Cola. And yet investors are still in the dark. You know, currently as it stands, the tax risk disclosures are very inadequate. You know, if you take the time to look at SEC documents, you'll see. And I know that because, as you say, I used to spend my time writing these tax disclosures in another lifetime. So I know that they don't give the investors the information that they need. If we are able to shine a light on this information, it would be, not only would it be useful to investors and other users, it would also have a deterrent effect. And so what I mean is it would likely stop companies from engaging in some of the most egregious profit shifting if they know that their investors are watching and could spot some of these red flags. We feel like that could actually stop some of these most aggressive profit shifting practices. So I'll just close by sharing a couple of kind of takeaways from the US update. We have seen a lot of positive momentum, such that, as we like to say, in our view, this question of public country by country reporting, it's not a question of if it will happen, but when. And that's not just us saying that, it's actually some of the big four tax advisors. That's a quote from KPMG US. So they also see this coming on the horizon. And a big part of the US story here is a very strong and growing support from investors that will get us there. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Zerka, for sharing the experience on the US front. And now I would like to hand over to you, Paul, please.
Thank you, Miran. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. So I'm coming to you from a very cold, wet and miserable Rochdale, England. To be honest, let's be open from the beginning. I'm going to try and just build on what everybody else has said and not do any repetition. I'm going to use some notes if that's okay, because I have a habit of naming companies and I want to make sure I don't expose both myself and Tax Justice Network to any libel actions. So Fair Tax Foundation run a thing called the Fair Tax Mark, and we go in and we check whether companies are responsible taxpayers. And we look through all sorts: beneficial ownership disclosure, tax policy, public country by country reporting, confidential data, and then ask that data to be in the public domain. And not just that the data is in the public domain, there is narrative next to the data to explain any unusual data points that may be in the data. And those data points may be really harmless and innocent, but we ask that the company talks about them and explains them, such that if an economically literate person saw the data, they would be satisfied that a rounded explanation has been provided. Initially, Fair Tax Mark was only available in the UK, but as of the end of 2021, we went international, and now we've got businesses in Denmark and Finland and Germany and Italy and Netherlands and Sweden. So we're growing rapidly, which is great. And all those businesses need to do public country by country reporting. So our perspective as somebody who works with business and inside business is that this is definitely the hottest topic in financial reporting right now. And if it is done with integrity, properly with integrity, the spirit of tax transparency, not just the letter of tax transparency, if it is done with integrity, it has a real ability to build trust with stakeholders for business. And trust is at a real premium right now for business. So it's quite a rare thing to think that that could happen. And at a macro level, there's a lot of evidence to suggest now that as with most international financial reporting transparency, it's there for a reason. The reason it is there is to enable capital markets to make more informed economic decisions, which in turn improves capital allocation and economic efficiency. Now, this is what capitalism wants. And this is what the institutional investors want. And this is what the banks want. And that's why they want public country by country reporting, because it enables them to do things. This is not a lefty ask. This is not a socialist ask. This is a capitalist ask. This is a good business ask. And we mustn't lose sight of that. Olivia previously made reference to the fledgling public country by country reporting that already exists in the banking sector in Europe and also already exists in the extractive sector. Now, we've just done a review of all the literature on the impacts of those two pieces of legislation, and we'll be releasing that next week. If you go on our website, Fair Tax Foundation, and you look at the resources section, you'll see an update of our why do public country by country reporting. And in it, we flag fully evidenced empirical data, which shows that for the banking and extractive sectors, since this legislation was introduced, there's been reduced use of tax havens, there's been reduced profit shifting, there's been increased effective tax rates, and there's been increased domestic revenue mobilisation. And, crucially, the benefits are more pronounced where a business has previously been highly predisposed to using tax havens in the past. Now, I think one of the reasons that this data hasn't come to the fore sooner is that it takes time. A big multinational business and its tax affairs is like a ship, and it takes time to turn the ship around. And sometimes we've seen instances where the business wants to do the right thing, and a tax haven, for example, will create blocks to stop that business exiting that country because they don't want to encourage a flood. So I think what's happened with much of this legislation that came in almost a decade ago, we're only now starting to see the benefit of it doing all these things. And it's massive, because if these trends hold out, that is an enormous motivation for politicians all over the world to really dig in and do more on this. So I wanted to flag that and say, we'll all be in the public domain from us next week. So I've already mentioned Fair Tax Mark. We require public country by country reporting. We want narrative as well as data. And what our businesses say to us initially is the narrative is harder than the data. The business can quite often make a decision to put the data in the public domain. But then when they have to explain those little weird things, it can take 6 months to a year for them to get their narrative signed off internally, so everybody in the company is happy. So we find it takes quite a long time for a business when they come to us for a Fair Tax Mark to normally get accredited, because they have to sort that narrative out. But what we find is once the narrative is sorted, as well as the data, and they've been through that pain, it is enormously beneficial to the business because they can speak coherently internally to staff, externally to investors, externally to journalists, etc. Once they get over that painful threshold, it's wonderful. But I was with a large retailer in Denmark last week, very progressive tax person, wants a Fair Tax Mark, and said to me confidentially that they were going to do the CBCR last year, but the head of PR vetoed it, backed up by the auditors, which is one of the big four accounting firms. And this was the head of tax and wanted to do it. So I think we have to be careful sometimes that we don't lose out on the fact there are some very good people, some very good professionals, some very good finance directors who want to do the right thing, some tax departments who want to do the right thing. They want to stand tall. If you talk to people like Ørsted, who are big offshore Danish wind turbine manufacturer and operator, they will tell you one of the biggest bonuses of getting the fair tax mark was the way the tax team could see the contribution they made to the firm, and the rest of the firm could see it. So these are really important motivators that we shouldn't lose sight of. Yes, voluntary public country by country reporting is still low right now. It is. It's increasing rapidly from a ridiculously low base, though. I think if you go on the EU Tax Observatory database for country by country reports, there's not even 100 on there. And we've got 100 businesses just fair tax bar. So it shows you how little there is. However, it is increasing rapidly. So I saw that recently that Deloitte did a big piece of research. They looked at 269 listed companies in 8 countries, Austria, Brazil, Germany. All this will be in this briefing next week, so you don't have to take notes. And what they found was that just 5% of those listed businesses across 8 major nations in the world were doing genuine public country by country reporting. And unfortunately, this is still our experience, that we're seeing a lot of businesses who claim, for example, that they are GRI compliant, who claim that they follow GRI 207. And when we look, I would say less than 5% of those who claim they are GRI compliant are GRI compliant. And that's a scandal. And so we need to be a little bit careful that we don't just think, oh, if we have a tax transparency framework and we put it out there and we ask business to do it, they're all going to do it with integrity. Some will, the vocal minority will, but there's a group who we have to be very careful with. And I liken this to, I worked on a lot of climate change stuff in the past, and I liken it to like 20 years ago when people were falling over themselves when Shell did its first carbon dioxide reporting. And they were winning prizes all over the world because they disclosed how much CO2 came from their operations. It didn't lead to any investment in renewables, etc. So what matters is not just tax transparency, responsible tax conduct. And I think that's the next phase of where we all need to go. Tax transparency is the baby step. It's the first step. It is not the end game. It's the first step. And we mustn't lose sight of that. The end game is responsible tax conduct. But tax transparency will be crucial to getting there, without a doubt. The only other couple of things I wanted to say, because I don't want to go too over time, is I was asked to say something about the UK. We're international, but we're based in the UK. We had this weird thing in 2016 in the UK where our parliament passed a piece of legislation saying, let's do public country by country reporting for businesses down to about 200 employees. And the power was voted on, but it was never enacted. And it was attached to a thing called a tax strategy, which doesn't really make sense right now. So what we're trying to do in the UK, ourselves, the all-party parliamentary group for responsible tax and anti-corruption, which is made of members of parliament from all different parties. It's cross-bench. We're going to rev up that campaign in the run-up to the UK general election to try and see whether we can help what's going on with Australia. So Jason will know that Australia and the UK are very competitive at sport. And those guys nearly batter us in virtually everything, probably except for darts. They batter us. Well, what we want to do on this one is to be a little bit competitive and see if we can't. We're going to say to the Labour Party over here in the opposition, who are almost certainly going to be elected at some point next year, the Labour Party and the opposition has done in Australia. Back them up, cover their back, match them, etc. Create something meaningful. Because I believe that if Australia and UK both did this, the ripples, the global ripples would be enormous. So again, our website next week, we're going to open a little microsite, which is going to start moving on that. We've got MPs from all parties already coming forward, standing up, trying to take the next step. And I'm sorry to the translators if I went really fast, sorry, but.
Thank you so much, Paul, for this experience. So I would like now to ask each of you, great panelists, a question, and then I would head the question. I will read some of the questions that we received in the Q&A. So my first question is to you, Jason, about the Australian experience. Basically, we know this is not the first time that the OECD put pressure on countries. We've seen that also with the local CBCR, right? When there were countries that have gone beyond the OECD standards, and after some pressure, even it was Spain and Germany, they watered down again the standards. So my question is, what could be the lessons that Australia can provide us, other countries, to be able to go beyond the OECD standard, but without being sabotaged this time? What would be like the good strategy for next time?
Well, I think it's clear that there is vicious opposition to basic transparency measures. And so I think we were caught a little bit by surprise, because that opposition remained very quiet until the very end. So I think be on guard for a sneak attack in your final stages. And the other thing, I mean, I'll just point to Olivia and Paul both mentioned the EU bank transparency, and also sort of the transparency that exists for extractives. It's absolutely clear that the arguments that companies, the OECD, the Big Four, make against public country-by-country reporting are quite ridiculous. There is no competitive disadvantage to disclosing basic financial information on a country-by-country level, but that is the number one argument that they will make. And then they will also make an argument about a compliance burden, which is, again, absolute BS. Because most of the large multinationals that we're talking about are already doing this, and to go from the OECD standards to the GRI standard is a very minimal process. And if a company doesn't have data on its country by country level reporting, then that's another problem that it needs to address pretty quickly.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now I would like to ask you, Olivia, one question. So you mentioned some of the limitations of the EU legislation and directive. You mentioned the geographic scope and the threshold and the corporate get out clause. So my question is, we still have maybe time to advocate for the countries that has not yet transposed the directive. What would you choose as a first strategy of all this limitation? What would be the maybe the most important one to fight for? And again, what can we learn from this experience of watering down one by one this kind of requirements by Parliament?
Thanks, Moran. And it's a difficult question, asking me to kill my darlings. But I mean, I think the experience in the EU directive has been, I mean, such an example of the challenges in having secret discussions among policymakers, especially when we have tax havens and those countries that are benefiting from the deeply unfair tax rules at the table. We have seen alarming lobbying by corporates. And in fact, we had one member state who was exposed for using the position written by their multinational representative body as the state position that was circulated at one point in time. And so we've seen some real challenges in how these rules are negotiated at EU level. And I think that's really reflected in the outcome. But if we only could change one thing, and this is what we're asking member states at national level to prioritise, it absolutely has to be the scope of the rules. Because right now, the EU directive isn't public country-by-country reporting. We're not asking companies to report on a country-by-country basis. That means if we want to go and follow the money as civil society organisations, as trade unions, as journalists, it just stops. We don't get a complete picture. We can't see. And it actually creates an incentive to hide tax avoidance in other places. So you can really continue to enjoy transparency, or intransparency rather. But on the other hand, the really massive issue with this is that EU countries already have access to non-public CBCR data. the data quality is very poor, and the policymakers don't get that data, only the tax authorities. But there is this deeply unfair system where countries in the global south who are most impacted by corporate tax avoidance don't have access to that information. And this EU directive doesn't help that at all, because those countries are not included in the template. So if member states could increase the geographic scope, it would at least mean that we can follow the money across countries and that there is some useful information for those outside the EU. But without that, this really is country by country reporting in name, but not at all in reality. So that is the one. And we did have some member states who were fighting for that when it came to the negotiations at EU level, which is why it was such a shock when it came to national level that they didn't implement that. For example, Denmark, which has a number of corporate transparency measures, including around tax at national level, actually had a national parliamentary position in favour of public country by country reporting that is fully disaggregated. But when they introduced the national legislation, they only introduced it in line with the EU directive. So it's not country by country, it's only for the EU countries. So we've seen a big step between the political position of governments and what's happening. And that's why I wanted to share that scandal around the European Commission interference. There is still an opportunity to influence member states. There's 16 and a half, I would say, countries that can still be negotiated. One of our other tax havens, Luxembourg, has gone a little bit further. So if there are those on the call who are working at national level, feel free to be in touch. We have very active civil society organisations who are trying to influence that at national level, and we have support available. But we have to push our governments, and we have to remind them that this is not just about public trust, this is about global justice. This is about addressing tax avoidance. This is about corporate transparency. It's about so many things beyond the technicalities of tax. And I think we've seen in the EU where there's huge public pressure that rules change, and where something is sidelined as a technical issue, it doesn't tend to work so well. So this really is something we need to keep political.
Great, thank you. And now I want to ask you, Zarka, you mentioned you talked a lot about the experience with investors and the great support from investors with a lot of money. And this is mainly, I think, present in the US, not only, but we see this kind of growing support mainly in the US. And definitely the business interest, and the deterrent effect and the geopolitical risks are some of the key considerations that can help us convince maybe policymakers and companies. So my question to you is, how do we help those investors to shift the narrative? Because, I mean, on its face, they are on the same side of the people who object to this legislation. And in line with this, maybe we have not, as CSO or researchers, maybe we have not done enough to show the importance of the data, how we use it, for instance. Because, for instance, if you look at beneficial ownership, for example, we have those leaks of the ICIJ, for instance, and we know how many people use those databases, even authorities. So maybe what can we do more to change the narrative here?
Thank you, Moran. These are big questions, not easy questions. But important ones. So to your first part, working with investors and shifting the narrative. I mean, I think that's already happening, it is. I think one of the other panelists, I think it was Paul. You said that this issue of tax transparency is emerging as a kind of burning issue on the corporate agenda, and I think that is in no small part thanks to efforts of everyone here and of tax justice advocates around the world, and reporters who have exposed the scandals, that there is much more awareness. So I think that is underway, and it's there's an opportunity to work together, and maybe, you know, sometimes you might feel, you know, maybe some of us are not used to, you know, there can be like some strange bedfellows, you know, working together with the business voices and the investor voices that are in favor of this, that really do understand the importance and are not just talking the talk, but also walking the walk. So, you know, doing more to applaud the companies that are reporting voluntarily. I think that's that is one thing that that is helpful, that, you know, we could probably see more of. And the second part of your question, in terms of the importance of data and demonstrating the use case, I think, well, let me start with saying that we at FACT are not primarily data users, but we work with a range of data users, both investors and those in civil society in developing countries. And so I think that there's a broad range of different data use cases. That said, you know, some of this is necessarily somewhat, you know, we have to make conjectures, just because the amount of data that we have is not huge. You know, we have a number of companies that have been reporting voluntarily. And there is some helpful information that Olivia outlined, that's, you know, based on the European experience with country-by-country reporting the financial sector. So there is some helpful evidence there, but by and large, you know, the biggest treasure trove of data is actually locked up by the OECD. So it is a bit of a black box, and I think we just you know, it's not accessible, or at least the granular versions of it are not accessible to academics or other non-governmental actors. So, you know, to some extent, we kind of have to get a better sense of the data before we can really demonstrate a strong use case. But I also want to say, you know, another part of my answer that I want to underscore the point I made earlier. It's important to address this issue of using the data, but let's also not lose sight of the potentially deterrent effect that even just the fact of data disclosure can have in and of itself. And we know this because, you know, there's been academic research into, again, I'm going to mention again the EU experience with country-by-country reporting in the financial sector that shows how impactful this can be in terms of, you know, cleaning up the corporate kind of tax practices. So, you know, I come to this issue after a number of years in the anti-corruption space, where we like to say sunshine is the best disinfectant, and I think that's equally true here. That, you know, if we are able to shine a light on this and make companies come clean, it will really put a stop to some of the most aggressive profit shifting that we have seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zurka. And now to you, Paul. My question to you is, I mean, you talked also about those companies who volunteer to publish their country-by-country reporting, and I wonder if we know kind of any prices that those companies pay because they publish the country-by-country reports, or maybe they even benefit for just publishing them. So how can we kind of use their experience to convince the world that this is the right thing to do?
All the businesses we've worked with, there is next to zero cash cost for doing country-by-country reporting. The data exists. There's a time cost, there's an energy cost, that's it. But there is no hard cash cost, whatever anybody says. That would be the first observation. Second observation, I would say, in terms of what are the benefits. I'll just give you a few anecdotes from businesses who've done it. Some of them are, I will name the business because I have permission and they've said it, and some I can't name the business. So one example would be Lush, the ethical posh soap, smelly soap retailer in 50 different countries. They first did public country by country reporting back in 2015. They were our first public country by country reporter. The CEO said when he saw the country by country report, he didn't know he had presence in certain countries till he saw the report. So that's one example of it actually generates new internal accounting data for the senior management team. And I've heard that quite a lot. And sometimes you can even have business heads don't want the people at the head office to see the raw data because there's either perhaps not the same profit margins as they've been spinning internally, or they're perhaps larger than anybody would want people to know because there's profiteering going on. It is useful new accounting data. That is one person as an example. Another one would be Unite, or a global business-to-business platform, multinational based in Germany. They are using their disclosures on not just public country by country, but open beneficial ownership disclosure, which is an absolute mess in Germany. You've got about 7 different registers you have to go to piece it together, to compete with Amazon. And they are overtly saying, if we can do it, why aren't Amazon doing it? They're building it into their competitive offer against Amazon. I had another CEO of a FTSE 100 company call me in, say, what's the quickest you've ever had a CBCR done? 12 weeks. I want it in 10. Said it's impossible. Look at you're in Switzerland, you're in all these countries. No, I'm not. I said, look back at your report and accounts. He had no understanding, and he was the CEO, how many dormant companies and how many trickle companies they had all over their structure. He was so angry, he called the FD and goes, why are we in all these countries? Don't know, nothing to do with me. It was the last lot. And sometimes it's not conspiracy, it's knock up. And there's just so many of these. Another one, a very large construction firm thought it had got a Queen's Award for Sustainable Development, but they'd done all this wonderful environment stuff, and HMRC vetoed it because they've been up to tax avoidance in the past. They are using their fair tax mark and their public CBCR now to build a better relationship with HMRC, who are now more likely to believe what they are doing because they have got the guts to put it in the public domain. There are so many businesses with so many anecdotes, qualitative anecdotes. And the only thing I would say, and I'll shut up, is there's no win here without us getting business on board. There's no win. We can't do it just as advocates. We've already talked about the importance of the institutional investors to the private sector. And let's be honest, 2/3 of them don't even do public country by country reporting on their own part accounts. Yeah. We don't win this without mobilizing progressive businesses. And if we do, we win it because there's enough now to make this happen.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone on this wonderful panelist for your sharing with us your insight in those different countries of working on country by country reporting and make it trying to make it public. And I think we've kind of finished with a positive note of what we need to do, and we know that the fight for public access for country by country reporting is definitely still on its way, but we have made a lot of progress in the last year, and we do hope that we can make even more progress with the UN Tax Convention to require public country by country reporting for all multinational in all jurisdictions. So we've tried to do our best to answer all the Q&As, and we don't have time to answer the remaining ones, but we hope everyone else have been enjoying this webinar, and I would like to thank also our audience and the good questions, and wish you all a good evening or night wherever you are, and morning wherever you are in the world at the moment.